Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we break down the biggest economic and political movements that have shaped our world. Today, we're diving into one of the most influential and controversial economic ideologies of the modern era, neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus. Now, before you doze off thinking this is just another dry economics lecture, trust me, this story is full of bold ideas, dramatic shifts, and some serious global consequences. We're talking about policies that transformed entire nations, from Latin America to Eastern Europe, and sparked heated debates that continue to this day. So, what exactly is neoliberalism? At its core, it's an economic philosophy that champions privatization, deregulation, and free trade, the idea that markets, when left alone, will naturally allocate resources efficiently and drive economic growth. Sounds simple enough, right? But then we have the Washington Consensus, a term that sounds like a secret meeting of world leaders in a shadowy boardroom, but is actually a set of economic policies promoted by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank in the 1980s and 1990s. Their goal? To encourage economic liberalization, especially in developing nations, by reducing government involvement and opening up economies to global markets. And why does this matter? Because these policies shaped global economics, impacting everything from poverty levels to financial crises, and sparking a fierce debate over whether they actually helped nations grow or just deepened inequality. Stick with me, because we're about to unpack the origins of neoliberalism, its biggest success stories, its biggest failures, and the lasting impact it has today. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind a bit, back to the 20th century. Neoliberalism didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was heavily influenced by the ideas of two economic heavyweights, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. These guys were the rock stars of free market economics, though instead of selling out stadiums, they were filling lecture halls and advising world leaders. Hayek and Friedman rejected the dominant economic approach of the mid-20th century, Keynesianism. Keynesian economics emphasized government intervention, think large public works projects, government spending to boost demand, and social welfare programs. This was the go-to approach for many Western economies, especially after the Great Depression and World War II. But by the 1970s, cracks were starting to show. The world was hit by a series of economic crises, including stagflation, a brutal mix of high inflation and stagnant economic growth. Suddenly, the old Keynesian playbook wasn't working. Governments were struggling to keep economies afloat, and people were looking for alternatives. This is where neoliberalism stepped in. Its core promise was simple but radical. Cut back government spending, privatize state-owned industries, remove barriers to trade, and let markets handle the rest. And some of the most powerful leaders of the era bought into the vision. We're talking about figures like Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US, who aggressively pushed neoliberal policies in their own economies. But the biggest impact was yet to come when these ideas spread to the developing world. Now, let's talk about the Washington Consensus, essentially the neoliberal game plan for developing countries. At its core, the Washington Consensus revolved around three main policies. Privatization, governments were encouraged, or, let's be honest, pressured, to sell off state-owned industries, banks, utilities, transportation, you name it, to private companies. The idea? Private businesses would run these services more efficiently than bloated government agencies. Deregulation, governments were told to step back and let markets operate freely. This meant cutting back restrictions on businesses, loosening labor laws, and allowing free competition in industries that were previously controlled by the state. Trade liberalization, countries were pushed to lower tariffs and trade barriers, making it easier for multinational corporations to invest, trade, and expand. The goal was to kickstart economic growth by making markets more open, competitive, and attractive to foreign investors. But as we'll see, the results weren't always as smooth as the economists had hoped. One of the most striking examples of the Washington Consensus in action was Argentina. In the 1990s, Argentina followed the neoliberal playbook to the letter, privatizing industries, cutting regulations, and even adopting a fixed exchange rate to make their currency more stable. And at first, it worked. GDP grew, inflation dropped, and foreign investment flooded in. It looked like a textbook success story. But then came the 2001 economic collapse. The problem? Argentina had relied too much on foreign debt and tied its currency to the US dollar, making it vulnerable to external shocks. When the global economy slowed, Argentina's economy crashed hard, leading to mass protests, economic turmoil, and a full-scale default on its debts. If you think Argentina's story was wild, wait until we get to Russia in the 1990s. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia underwent shock therapy, a brutal transition from a planned economy to a free market practically overnight. The idea was to privatize everything quickly, break up state monopolies, and let capitalism do its thing. What actually happened? The rise of the oligarchs. Instead of spreading wealth and competition, state assets were sold off to a handful of powerful insiders, creating a new elite class of billionaires who gained control over Russia's industries, from oil to banking. Meanwhile, the average Russian suffered from hyperinflation, unemployment, and deep poverty. Instead of a thriving free market, Russia ended up with a highly concentrated economy controlled by a few ultra-wealthy figures, many of whom still hold influence today. Now, while some nations fully embraced neoliberal reforms, others took a different approach, most notably China and several Southeast Asian countries. Instead of rapid privatization and unrestricted free markets, these nations followed a model of gradual economic reform while maintaining strong government control over key industries. China, in particular, is a fascinating case. Under Deng Xiaoping's leadership, China shifted from a strictly communist economy to a more market-driven one, but without fully adopting neoliberal policies. What did they do differently? They opened up certain sectors to private and foreign investment, but kept state control over critical industries like banking, energy, and telecommunications. They allowed private businesses to grow, but made sure the government still had a major role in guiding economic policy. Instead of immediately cutting off government support, they phased in free market policies slowly, ensuring economic stability. And the results? China's GDP exploded, growing at an average of 9% per year, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. Other nations in the region, like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Singapore, followed similar models, balancing market forces with state intervention. This stands in stark contrast to the Washington Consensus approach, which promoted rapid, sweeping changes. China and Southeast Asia proved that you could open up your economy without fully surrendering control to the free market, a lesson that many developing countries would later take to heart. Of course, neoliberalism hasn't been without its critics, and the backlash has been fierce. One of the biggest arguments against neoliberal policies is wealth inequality. While free market policies often increase overall economic growth, they don't always distribute that wealth evenly. Critics argue that neoliberalism disproportionately benefits the wealthy, allowing corporations and elites to accumulate massive fortunes while wages stagnate for the average worker. Then there's financial instability. When markets are deregulated, financial institutions often take bigger risks, which can lead to economic bubbles and crashes. Case in point, the 2008 global financial crisis, which was largely fueled by deregulated banking practices and risky speculation. Another major point of contention? The role of the IMF and World Bank. Many argue that their structural adjustment programs, which forced developing nations to adopt neoliberal policies in exchange for financial aid, often made things worse, leading to social unrest, unemployment, and economic downturns in struggling economies. In short, while neoliberalism promised prosperity and efficiency, it also created deep inequalities and financial vulnerabilities, sparking calls for reform. On the flip side, supporters of neoliberalism argue that despite its flaws, it has generated massive economic growth and increased global prosperity. One of the biggest selling points of neoliberal policies is economic efficiency. Free markets are often better at allocating resources than bureaucratic governments, leading to higher productivity and less waste. And while inequality may rise, neoliberal policies have undeniably boosted GDP in many countries. In nations that embraced free trade and open markets, economic growth has often followed. Another key argument? Foreign investment. By removing trade barriers and opening up markets, many countries have attracted major multinational corporations, bringing in jobs, technology, and infrastructure development. At the end of the day, neoliberalism is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but it has undeniably played a key role in shaping modern economic policy. So, where does that leave us today? In recent years, governments have started re-evaluating neoliberal policies, leading to a resurgence of state capitalism. Countries like China and Singapore have shown that free markets don't have to mean weak governments. Instead, strategic state intervention in key industries, especially in tech and manufacturing, has proven highly successful. There's also a renewed focus on industrial policy. Rather than leaving everything to the market, governments are reasserting control over sectors critical to national security and long-term economic stability. And let's not forget the shift in global trade dynamics. With rising protectionism, many countries are moving away from unrestricted free trade, introducing tariffs and trade restrictions to protect domestic industries. The result? a more mixed economic model, where free markets coexist with strategic government intervention, a shift that challenges the old neoliberal order. Looking ahead, the biggest economic challenges of the future won't just be about markets versus government, they'll be about technology. One of the most pressing concerns? AI and automation. As technology reshapes industries, millions of jobs are at risk of being automated away. This raises serious questions about whether free markets alone can handle the transition, or if governments need to step in with policies like universal basic income or job retraining programs. Then there's the issue of rising protectionism. Countries are becoming more skeptical of global free trade, imposing tariffs and restricting foreign competition. This could signal a major shift away from the neoliberal consensus that dominated the last few decades. Finally, there's the challenge of balancing markets with regulation. Future policies will likely aim to integrate free market efficiency with stronger social protections, addressing concerns about inequality while maintaining economic growth. So, after all that, where does neoliberalism stand today? Well, it's still incredibly influential. Even though some governments are moving away from extreme free market policies, neoliberal principles still shape global trade, finance, and economic decision-making. But at the same time, criticism is growing. Rising inequality, financial instability, and environmental concerns have fueled calls for reform, pushing many governments to rethink their approach. What we're seeing now is the rise of hybrid economic models, where free market policies are blended with strategic state intervention. This approach seeks to harness the benefits of markets while mitigating their downsides, a potential middle ground in the economic debate. So, what's the final takeaway? Neoliberalism isn't dead, but it's evolving. While its core ideas still influence global economics, governments are increasingly adapting policies to balance market efficiency with stability and equity. There's no doubt that free markets have driven innovation, investment, and growth, but they've also led to financial crises, inequality, and instability. The challenge moving forward is finding the right balance, harnessing the strengths of capitalism while addressing its shortcomings. And that brings us to the end of today's deep dive. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think neoliberalism has been a success or a failure? And if you love learning about history and economics, check out some of my other videos. We've got plenty more fascinating topics to explore. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History, and I'll see you in the next one.